What's up, everybody? I wanted to tell you about what I've been thinking about while I fold my laundry. Um, because last night I had a really great men's group, and it's been having a big impact on my day and on my life. So it's been on my mind about what my men's group is and how can we make it better. And then I realized not a lot of people have a men's group or know what that is. So I want to just express my experience of men's groups to see if it resonates. So, where to begin? A men's circle is basically just like a safe space to be who you are. It's like a container where you can be your full self without having to fear judgment, except for self judgment. Um, so it allows for a lot of things that we repress on the everyday to come up and to come out and for you to get to know those parts of yourself that are not well known, even to you. So that's the idea. It's like personal growth, self-help, some like to say, but it's not self-help. It's community-supported self-help. It's almost like what I've heard is a term called co-counseling, where it's like not therapy, but it's therapeutic. So we get together, and it takes a long time to build the capacity to go deep. It's like a submarine. It has to be strong in order to handle the pressure of going very low. So you start building this container together, and when people leave, it gets a little weaker. When people come on, it can get stronger. It can, it needs to be a safe, trusting container for big things to come out. Yeah. So, but it's very therapeutic from the get-go because it's community, and it's a new feeling to be in a space with men and to be vulnerable about what's true for you. And so there's a number of ways that that's accomplished, mostly through the structure of the group, the agreements. The beginning of the container is agreements about what the container is. What are the agreements, and making them explicit and then sticking to them. So, for instance, we're going to meet once a week from this time to that time. And what are the obligations for not showing up? Do you need a text if you're not going to show up? Can you only miss a certain number? Whatever it is. So we have an incentive structure with money to help people invest in showing up, right? There is like a notion, but it's very sliding scale. It's appropriate for whatever budget, but it's just a commitment to say, like, there's a certain thing when you buy a ticket to something versus when you get a ticket for free. It's easier to throw away the one you get for free. So we have a small fee that is like help to incentivize people that goes to the facilitator, which is usually me, but when I can't make it, it's another man in the group. And so you have these rules to show up, to meet, to create this container together. That's step one. And then the rules for inside the meeting. Confidentiality is a huge one, right? What happens in the circle stays in the circle. What else? So feedback, right? What kind of feedback is allowed, and what's the process for soliciting that feedback? So advice is generally not advised because there's other ways to give feedback that aren't advice that are potentially more constructive, unless a person asks explicitly for advice. We usually we do active listening, and then we give reflections, such as, like, I heard you say this. Do you want to go more into that? Like, I noticed that you kind of got choked up when you talked about this. What's that about? Do you want to go into that? It's all very consent based. That's the most important thing, is that a man has to do his own work, but he can be guided and facilitated by other men to go deeper into himself and find out what's going on in there. So when you set up these agreements, that builds trust, because when people show up on time, when people show up regularly, when people adhere to the agreements, that's called accountability. I did what I said I was going to do. That builds trust in this container. And this is this whole approach, you might notice, is very masculine. It's very archetypally strict. But what's healthy about that too is that it allows for softness within the container. The stronger that the outside is, sometimes rigidity can really create safety for softness. So that's one of the aspects of the importance of really keeping agreements and keeping a clear container. And I'll talk more about how to maintain that clearness in the container soon. But so you get the agreements, you show up, and you start a meeting. And what does that look like? Well, we have a certain structure, and I think it's important for people to figure out what structure works for them through trial and error. We're still making it up as we go. But what we do is we start with just chit chat, and then right at 7:00 we start, and there's a business round. So before we get into emotional, we deal with the logistics. Are there any logistical questions? Someone's schedule's not working, someone needs to miss, whatever. Logistics. Also, the agreements could get brought up. I want to add this agreement, or like we can have a discussion. That's all very heady discussions. But then as we drop into the emotions, the first thing we do is a short 4-minute meditation. Sometimes it's just silent, sometimes it's guided. Oh, before that, sometimes there's a poem to just get people into like their heart space, reflective space. So there might be a poem that's a prompt potentially, but the meditation is really just about dropping into the body. This is kind of why I'm doing this today, because yesterday I did one about dropping into the body. And so yeah, you drop in through the meditation just to notice what's going on for you in those 4 minutes. And then, there might be a persistent thought, that's kind of a primer for whatever you're maybe bringing to the circle. So then after that meditation is the check-in round, the first official kind of round. And then it's called sometimes the lover round, because it's really meant to like drop us into our hearts. So this first round is just a check-in. It's kind of what's going on for me, really trying to talk about what is present in the moment. Not like yesterday I was feeling, or last week I was feeling, like trying to keep it in the present moment and trying to minimize story. Oftentimes it's easy to just go back into like, well, today was hard because I was late to work and I got a flat tire, and that kind of story. There's emotion underneath that story, and the helpful thing is to just break new ground. Like don't just tell a story that you would tell to your friend at the bar or your wife or whatever. It's like what's coming up now in this moment around that. What feelings were you having at that time? Like what's really present emotionally in this moment, in addition to whatever necessary story goes along with that. So it's important to know some context for the emotions to resonate. But just trying to make it as like heartfelt and honest and vulnerable as is appropriate for this check-in, which is like up to 4 and 5 minutes. It's pretty brief to just get into what's going on, how you been. And then after everybody does that, we usually take a breath together as we transition into the next section, which is called the warrior round, which is about accountability. And now that we've established some trust and some heart space, we look at refining any problems or hard feelings and just like shoring up the container before we go even deeper. So accountability is just checking in about agreements of the group. So if someone was late, we should bring that up because that was a broach of an agreement. Breach? Broach? Whichever one is the pen. So accountability looks like there's 3 subsections of that. The first one is just, I said I would show up at 7 and I was late, so that's a thing. Then there's an option to whether to do work around that. And that allows for man to look if there's a pattern or like a nugget of learning that can be had from that breach of an agreement. So it's like if a man is late to the meeting and he chooses to look at that, as they say, that's to get back in integrity. It's to address this, just do work around it, to address it, to own a piece of it. If for instance, a man was late and he had texted before the group saying, I'm going to be late, he feels in integrity. He's like, I stick to the agreement. I'm good. I was late, but I don't need to do work around that. And that's fine too. So to do work around a piece of accountability, though, there's a process that I got from the Mankind Project. It's pretty great. It's about looking for a shadow. This is part of like shadow work, which is like an unconscious part of ourselves that might be making decisions on our behalf. So did our unconscious make us late is essentially the question. And how we get there is a process. And that I'm not going to get in, I'll just go into it very quickly if you're interested. Questions are, what was your agreement? Did you keep your agreement? Usually it's a no. What did you choose to do instead? So that is a hard one sometimes because we have to admit that we actually made a choice to do something else. There was a split second, a moment where we could have chosen to do the thing. Usually there's like, I could have made a different choice. And so that's interesting. And then another piece, the next piece is, what was the impact? What was the impact on you? What was the impact on others? And that keeps it in the heart space, just to like help make it real. And it's not about guilt and shame. It's like honest. It's owning. It's taking responsibility. It's saying this might have had an impact on the group. I was late 15 minutes to this meeting, and it disturbed the group, and it could have disturbed someone's work. Stuff like that. It affects me because now I'm feeling shame for maybe not being worthy of this group. Blah blah blah. Whatever the impacts were of that choice to not keep the agreement. And if there was legitimately like no choice, then maybe there's no work around it. Maybe it was just a pure mistake. But the opportunity in this accountability process is to harvest any lessons and learning out of our mistakes. We don't need to beat ourselves up and keep tally of every mistake we've ever made. It's just that we can look at it as a gift and see and open it up and see if there's a gift in there. And usually there is, because usually our mistakes come from patterns. And we can look at the patterns to try to deduce what's underneath that pattern and then try to address that. So that's the rest of the process, where you acknowledge something that is underneath, like the psychology that was underneath that subconscious choice, such as like, I didn't really want to come to this meeting anyway, for instance. Like, what was the deeper shadow? And like, why didn't you want to come to the meeting? I don't think I'm worthy of this group. Why don't you think you're worthy of this group? Like, what are the subconscious thoughts that are kind of driving this resistance or this being late? And this is just a random example. But that's the beauty of this, is that there's like a million permutations of what happened for men, but there's also like patterns of shame, guilt, fear, sadness, whatever, that are shadows that often drive our behaviors without us knowing. So then that's the first part of the accountability round. Then the second part is to help other people be an account. Oh, sorry, the last piece about the accountability round is just that when a man figures out what might be underneath this, what the shadow is, then there's a new agreement to try to correct it. And it's very small, but it's appropriate to the shadow. So it's like, I don't think I'm worthy of this group. Well, what's something you can do to show yourself that you are worthy of this group? Or what's something you can do to push back against the pattern that you discovered? So that's like, I'm going to give myself a bubble bath tonight to show myself that I'm worthy. I like that one, because we so often, it's really important to externalize the internalized. And so when we have an internalized belief that like, I'm not really worthy of good things, let's say, well, what's something I can do for myself to like treat myself? Because we need to do that. Like, we need to do that for other people to show we love them and that they're special, and we need to do that for ourselves. So it's a gift to yourself, which is uncommon sometimes, as like a real acknowledgement of like, I'm doing this for me, not so that I can be well rested so that I can go to work tomorrow and be good. It's like, what's something I just do for me because I love myself, something like that. So that's the accountability piece, is to take the mistake and turn it into a flower. And then to support accountability, that's just helping another man remember that he is out of integrity in some piece of his agreements, out of account, out of integrity, kind of loose terms. But so that's just like, hey Bob, I saw that you were late to the meeting, and curious if you want to look at that, or if you can acknowledge that, or whatever. But there's no shame or guilt trying to be projected onto that. But if some emotions do come up around whatever in the group, that's the third piece of the warrior round, is to just clear any resentments and or energy that's been stuck in the group. So the question is, at the beginning of the charge round, or the clearing round. Okay, so the clearing round is the third piece of the warrior round. And that's just like, does any man have a charge that's preventing him from being present? So, and it's better if it's like a charge in the group. If I have a charge with my boss, and that's like one thing, but if I have a charge with the man across the circle, that's more important, let's say, for this purpose. But both could be done in this clearing. But right now, it's important to focus on a clearing in the circle. And so that's like also a really interesting process that I'll try to do briefly. So if I have a charge with the man across the circle, I'll ask someone to facilitate. And then we'll stand up if we're in person, and we'll put our hand on a staff or whatever. You want to stay heart connected to this person, because this is not about shame and guilt and blame. So I have a problem with Bob, let's say, and we look at each other, and there's a facilitator, and the facilitator just guides me through. And the questions are, first, Bob, this is about you. Bob, are you willing to acknowledge this is about you? Sorry, my role play is getting confused. The person with the charge, let's say that's Brian. Brian, are you willing to admit that this is about you and not about Bob? And Brian has to acknowledge, yes, I acknowledge this is about me, not about Bob. So this is automatically like, we're not here to blame Bob. So what's the data? Blah, blah, blah. This was what happened. This is what I saw. This is like very objective, third party. Then what were your feelings about that? Then what were your judgments about that? And then, my feelings were that I was mad, I was frustrated, I was angry. My judgments were that this guy is an asshole. And it's just important to own. I judge that this guy's an asshole. Another way you can do it is that, what are your judgments about your own feelings? If you want to keep it even more removed from Bob. So it's just trying to judge up any kind of like subconscious like narrative that's going on about this. Okay, let's get it all on the table. Now, looking at this table of all these feelings and judgments, where else do you see that showing up in your life? Are these similar judgments and feelings you have about your spouse, or about your boss, or about your dad, or about your mom, or about your sister, your brother? Like, is there energy in your life? Are these triggers for you that are just happening to be triggered by Bob, and that maybe you're bringing a little extra energy to what Bob's actually doing? And usually the answer is yes. The whole point is that this has to be owned in some way. And maybe, so there's a piece about maybe Bob needs to do something differently and was willing to do something differently. But right now, we're just trying to use this as work for the man, Brian, in this situation. To say, what is your piece of this? Oh, I acknowledge that this is how I'm getting triggered about my dad, about blah, blah, blah. Okay, are you willing to retract that projection that you're bringing to this situation? The man, as well as he can, retracts that and owns that this is some of me in this conflict. Okay. Now, knowing that you might not get what you're asking, is there a request that you'd like to make of Bob? Knowing that he might say no. Yes, I would ask that Bob refrain from doing such and such. Okay, thank you. Is there anything else that you need to express right now within reason? And hopefully not, but maybe there's, and this is a piece of my teacher too. I just need to name that because that's on my mind. Like, what is it? What's underneath all this? And then, thank you. Bob, hearing all that, is there anything that you want to own in this situation? And then Bob usually says, yeah, I can acknowledge this has happened. And Bob is in a delicate position here. We don't want to like launch any arrows back. Bob might have to do his own clearing after this. But this is right now about Brian, and Bob is just here to reflect and own also. And hopefully it doesn't get too messy. Sometimes it gets messy. Messes happen. At the beginning, that's why we got to keep it heart-based, and that's why we have a container. Yeah. So Bob then owns his piece, and maybe is willing, maybe isn't willing. Hopefully this doesn't drag on into like a negotiation of terms, but maybe it does. And depending on how serious it is for the circle, is it about the coming late policy? Maybe we need to have a clear decision about that, and maybe we save that for another part of the meeting where it's more cerebral, like the business section. But this is really just about getting Brian to get clear so that he can be present for the rest of the meeting. That's what the clearings are about, just to try to clear the energy. And maybe if it's supercharged, maybe somebody needs to leave the group. Maybe you need to split into 2 groups for tonight, and then who knows, But I've never seen it that bad. I've heard it can get ugly, but that's why it takes time and practice and rhythms and all that. So then you go through that gauntlet, and now you're clear, and you get to drop it a deeper level into trust, because that's a huge. Those are some big processes, and vulnerability comes up. So it really does help to establish the container. One thing though, you don't want that to go on too long, because it can minimize this time in the rest of the meeting, because now we are in what's called the magician round, or the work round. And it's called magician because you go into a space that is very mystical, because it's not something we experience very often, and vulnerability comes up, things that you might not know about yourself, tears, things happen, and it's great. And the work round can look like different things, but it can have like more of a structure, like pairing. One thing I love to do at the beginning of a men's circle with the work round, to introduce people and to train them, is to do reflective listening. It's an exercise, but is also a prompt. So you give a prompt. What was the best part of your week? What's the thing you love about yourself the most? What's a experience you never had that you wish you had? Something to kind of jar a personal reveal. The listener, you get into pairs for this group, for this exercise. Or you could do 3 people, but basically another person listens to understand, not to respond. That's the key. If I had one takeaway, you listen to understand, not to respond. So you open yourself up as a vessel of listening, of understanding, as an empath. We all have empathy, and you exercise your empathy, and you say, what is going on for this person? What are they saying? And you listen, and then you hear. Okay? Get with me now. Get on my level. You listen, and then you hear, and then you understand. And then you can serve. And that serving gets tricky, because sometimes ego gets in the way. But the key in this exercise is to just listen and then repeat back. I heard you say, I heard you say, I heard you say, I heard you say. So you set a timer for like a minute. A minute's actually a pretty long time, because one person shares, this is what's going on for me, this is what's going on for me. And then after that minute, that person listening is then asked, what did you hear? And then it's actually a beautifully hard skill to like track what a person is saying. But it serves the man, because then you can reflect clearly, like a notation. It's because oftentimes when a man is sharing vulnerably, he doesn't even know the words he's using. He's just like digging, and then you're like, oh, I heard you use the word like frustrated. And then sometimes that man's like, I didn't know that, but it kind of codifies like what was being expressed. And then it allows the man too to say, like, oh, did I say that? Oh, I didn't even, it's not so much frustrated, it's more like angry or whatever. It allows for that man to get more clear about what he's saying. And then, so in addition to that, a lot of men, as they're primed or prone to this work, they have extra insights. And this is interesting, because it could be a projection, and that's what you got to watch out for. And what I mean by that is like, it's a man taking something from his own life and saying, oh, this is your problem. It's a filter that a man puts on. It's a projection. So, projections are everywhere all the time. And it's just about trying to own them and acknowledge them. And when you get really good at listening and understanding, you can minimize your projections. So if I'm listening to a man and he's talking about his hard work day, his boss, right? And like I kind of mentioned before, it's like, oh, I noticed when you mentioned your boss, you like did this, a couple times, and you reflect. Is there stress there? You can reflect what is coming through for you, but you want to be careful not to lead the man, because sometimes it's actually very easy to discern, like, oh, this man's dealing with grief about his like grandmother or whatever. So it's important to let a man discover the path himself and not say, this seems like this is about your mother. You could say, like, is there any leading questions? Like, I heard you, speak about your mother, and it's like, is this about that? Being gentle and letting the man lead himself, because, it's, better for a man to do his own work with the support of the group rather than I'm prescribing, I know what this is about. Because you might be wrong, and it's not as healthy for the man doing the work. So this is a reflective listening, back to the reflective listening exercise. It's really important to be clean with your feedback and to not manipulate the other person to be, so you can be right, and to just ask objectively, as objectively as possible, without, needing to seem like you're doing a good job. You're not there to do a good job for anybody. You're just there to be honest and authentic and vulnerable. And to be self-aware. Like, am I taking up too much space? Is now the right time to talk? I see that a lot, especially with men who are inexperienced. They're like, I have something to say. And it's like, claim it. Claim, if you have something to say, say it. And if you don't. But when you raise your hand kind of halfway, it's a thing to assess out in the agreements of your group about how to give feedback, when to give feedback. But it's like, you develop confidence over time, and it's hard to start giving reflections and feedback. And so whatever you can do to practice that in terms of like listening exercises, that's I think the biggest piece. When I started doing this work and I saw men facilitate men, not just for a minute, they reflected for like 20 minutes, back and forth, tracking all this journey that the man is going into himself. Like, so we started with frustrated, but now I'm hearing you say sadness. And that's sadness, and so like tracking all the pieces so that a man can get a sense of himself. That's what the facilitation, that's what the container does. And that's the magician round. And it's magic because, like, we don't know what's going to happen, and you can have different exercises, prompts. Sometimes in another group we did like a movement piece, which was like a dance type of embodiment, whatever, it's the magic. You can do whatever you want. But that's the purpose, is to help people get in touch with themselves. Which, the only other place that, well, a lot of people have their ways of doing that, whether it's church or whether it's therapy or whether it's dance or rituals of some kind. But that's what we do in a men's circle. So wrapping it up here, so the way that we split up the time for the magician round is that basically right now we just take the number of people, divide it evenly, and it should work out. And I do a 2-minute warning. Sometimes people can ask for their own specific warning, a 1 minute or 5 minute. But if a man gets 10 minutes, let's say, if there's 60 minutes left and there's 6 men, 10 minutes a man. And you want to leave a little time for the last round, which is the checkout round. Just pretty simple. It's also called the King's round or the Blessing round. It's like honoring what just happened. It's saying like, we did a thing, and we're going back. We're going back into the world, and we're closing the meeting, and we're going back into like our way of being that's more casual. And after the group, there's chit chat, and people do still kind of are dropped into the emotional space, but it's just a closure round to reflect on how you are in this moment. So it's a mirror to the check-in round, the lover round, with how you're doing in the moment. It's very similar, and it's a little briefer. And somebody could say like, checking out, feeling grateful, checking out, with a new sense of motivation to do this thing in my life, or um, or when when this was brought up, it really moved me. Like I really honor you for doing that certain work, John. It's a time for just like what's on your heart and expressing it, and like transition out of the meeting. So it's usually about 5 minutes. Um, yeah, and then any other kind of last discussion type little pieces, if there's like, oh, and I promise to do this. Um, yeah, so that's how a men's circle goes. And then one thing that I didn't really mention is that a pattern that we've gotten into and that's supportive to a lot of men is making agreements. So, you know, that's kind of a tool. Like we did it in the accountability. I talked about it in the accountability piece. It's to externalize the internal. So a lot of times in a men's work, it's like, oh, I really need to call that guy. And it's like, do you want support in doing that? Do you want to agree with this group to come back next Tuesday and say, yes, I called that guy? Or do you need to do it by tomorrow? And so do you want to send a text to the group that says, I called the guy? Because that kind of peer pressure or, societal support can be healthy. It's actually very much how we're designed as people to retain the trust of our community. And so if I say I'm going to do something, when I do it, I feel good because I realize that I have people that care about me and what I'm doing. So that's a really beautiful part of that, like a side thing that we do during the week. We check in. Yes, I did my thing. No, I didn't do my thing. And then it's not a lot of text. It's like 5 a week maybe. But then when we come back, there's the opportunity to either celebrate what you did or to look at why you didn't. And that's part of the accountability round, which can also be done during the magician's round. One of the major pieces of this is consent. So, you consent to the agreements and then you're expected to stick to the agreements. You consent to do work, but you also can pass at any time. There's no coercion. It can feel a little pressury sometimes. I think we're used to that as a society, at least in certain cultures. Like my culture is like, do you want to do this? Is like kind of a request versus a genuine question. And so sometimes I get worried that like, do you want to do this? And people go like, yeah. And it's like, no, do you actually want to do this? Is this something you like really consent to? And similarly, it's like, do you want to talk about like, oh, I heard you talk about your brother. Do you want to talk about that? And someone can be like, no, either that's too much or there's nothing there. And it's very consent driven. And so with that, yeah, a man can pass at any time. And yeah. So that's what I do as a men's circle facilitator. And if you have any questions, like post them below. That would be cool. Or yeah. And what else? Yeah. I don't know. I think that was I think I got all my laundry done. Great. All right. Take care, y'all. Sending you lots of love. And do reach out if you have any questions.